This week's video is all about chucks and handles. Chucks are solid clay objects on top of which pots can be trimmed. I keep mine leather hard as I find they stick to the pots a little better and they can be trimmed to fit new shapes if need be. I keep them wrapped in plastic and kept in an airtight box, and they're completely solid, which helps them stay leather hard. When in normal use, the chuck is tap centered and attached down to the wheel, either with some slip underneath it or 3 lugs of soft clay pushed around the base. A leather hard cup is then placed on top and tap centered until spinning true. If you're really accurate when making chucks, you can even make the clay shape beneath match the interior form of the pots you're making, and by having a flat top, the chuck can even support the base of the pot. That way you can trim it quite thinly without it bowing inward. But what I like about chucks is that their solid round form corrects any slight distortion there might be in the rim of the pot, as the still relatively flexible leather hard cup is pressed down over it. Once centered, I push down gently, and then I place a spinner tool on top. This one's made by a potter and engineer called Richard Carter. Through this, I can apply downward pressure, without the base potentially distorting, as it spreads the downward force out, like lying down on thin ice. I can then trim the sides, and when I'm done, I can just remove the spinner in order to trim the base. Turning pots on a chuck also lets you turn the entirety of the walls and the base without having any lumps of clay or mechanical arms like you have on a Giffen grip getting in the way. And there is nothing wrong with either of those techniques, but when trimming many multiples of the same shape, like these cups, it can really help speed things up. Anyway, like you may have seen, this chuck is slightly too small for these cups, so I'll make another. But first, after I'm finished using a chuck, I dunk it in water and then wrap it up tightly in plastic. And by doing this, and as long as you actually use them relatively regularly, they can stay more or less leather hard for years. I then place the wrapped chuck back into its airtight box until it's ready to be used again. So I'll throw a chuck that's a bit larger, which will be useful beyond just this single batch of cups, as the chuck's tapering form will hopefully fit a whole variety of different pots. And as this is just a solid clay object, it's quite easy to throw. So I'll speed through the centering process until the point where the mound of clay is roughly the right shape, which is here, the sides tapering in and with a relatively flat top. Ultimately, the shape of the chucks you make are entirely based on the actual pots you are making, and whilst one size doesn't fit all, this sort of shape will be quite useful for many different types of pots, mugs and vases especially, and anything else with a rim that flares out slightly. Once the approximate shape is there, I scrape away as much slip as possible to refine the shape and to create a surface that's much drier than it was before. And if you do make it too large, or it doesn't quite fit the pot you want to trim, you can just trim this shape back until it fits the pot you're making perfectly. Once the surface of the chuck is more or less where I want it, I'll offer one of my cups up to it, just to double check, and then I can begin the slow process of drying it out, for which I'll use a heat gun, a paint stripper. You can equally use a gas torch, or you can just leave it out overnight so the chuck can dry out to leather hard naturally. But this does work really well, provided you don't keep the heat gun on one spot for too long, as you can quite easily dry it out too rapidly and cause the chuck to crack. Once mostly leather hard, I cleaned up the base and then burnished the sides of the chuck using a flexible metal kidney, whilst also giving it another once over with the heat gun. Usually, I wouldn't rush this process, but as I wanted to trim the cups that afternoon, I thought it worth doing. And as you can see, the cup now sits higher and the sturdy, solid chuck will help keep that rim nice and round. And as it tapers in from bottom to top, it should make it useful for a variety of the pots I make. And even though I have dried out the surface quite thoroughly, the interior clay of this chuck will still be soft, which means I need to be careful about how I handle it for the next few days. For instance, I don't want to pick it up with my fingertips digging into it, as that probably will indent the surface. Now I can begin trimming properly. The cup is placed atop the chuck gently and tap centered until the base portion, not necessarily the rim, is spinning true. I then do the same for the spinner, through which I'll be pushing down quite firmly, and now the trimming can start. This is the process of removing clay from the walls and refining the shape of the pot. And whilst these cups were already thrown quite thinly, I want them to be thinner and lighter yet, and I want the form itself to be straighter and more well defined. This is also the opportunity to finish the base of the pot, which at this stage is quite rough, as it's just been wired through and lifted off the wheel. This means the wiring off marks are still there, which you can leave if you want to, and in some cases they look quite nice. With the walls done, I then removed the spinner and measured the base so that each cup in this small batch would be exactly the same. I then scrape down the sides, removing the more prominent marks left by the trimming. Equally, as this tool has such a long flat edge, I can lay it against the trim pot to make sure the form is more or less straight. Next, the spinner can be removed and the beveled edge is trimmed around the outside. This removes some excess clay from this bottom corner, together with making an edge that's less likely to chip, and it also creates a gap underneath the pot which casts a shadow, making the pot look almost as if it's hovering, as opposed to finishing flush against whatever surface it's placed upon. Once the beveled edge and base have been trimmed, I'll burnish these two areas with the smooth portion of a metal kidney. I don't mind if there are really subtle marks left on the base, but I want it to be smoother than it was, and I want the lines between angles to be really crisp. Then I stamp the pot with my maker's mark, and then carefully remove the pot, trying not to squeeze it too much as I lift it away. In most cases when you trim pots, you're revealing clay underneath that's a bit softer than what's on the outside, and once the walls and the base have been turned, often the pot will soften slightly, so you do need to take care when removing it from the chuck. If it does feel like it's stuck in place, the thing to do is to gently clasp your hands all around the vessel so all your digits and your palm are just about touching. I then give the wheel a gentle spin, and with any luck the pot should stick to your hands and then lift away. Once this batch of pots has been trimmed, the next step is to attach and pull their thin, fine handles. But first I need to wire the chuck off the wheel, which is done by holding a taut wire and dragging it underneath the vessel. I then use a sheet of dry cleaner's plastic that I have a giant roll of, which I think will last a good portion of my life. The chuck is then carefully wrapped up and stored away, ready for use another day. It wasn't until the following morning until I got around to handling these. I always start by laying a sheet of plastic out over a board, and then I fetched my board of trimmed cups, which I kept wrapped tightly overnight, as I most definitely didn't want them drying out too much before attaching and pulling the handles. I don't use many tools for this process. There's the basin of water, a towel and a sponge for cleaning my hands as I work. Then there's a hole piercer, which I occasionally use the smooth sides of, a serrated kidney, and a bucket of slip, and a brush. This is the glue, if you will, which helps me join the handles to the cups. And here's a fired version of the cup I've been making, with a small handle that springs upwards, before looping back down and joining near the base. They're quite fine as handles go, especially compared to my normal straight-sided mugs. This makes them quite hard to pull, and for these I prefer starting off with relatively firm clay. I begin this process by taking a lump and roughly patting and rolling it into a tapering shape that's larger on the top and then tapers down to a finer point. It doesn't need to be perfect, but a lot like when throwing on the wheel, if you begin trying to throw with a shape that's really irregular, then it's only going to make your life more difficult. And so this is what I aim for, and it's from this lump of clay I'll make all the individual handles from. But first I need to pull it and stretch it out into a much longer length, which I do like this. I use a wetted right hand to pinch near the top of the lump of clay, and then I pull from the top downward, quickly and firmly, and with a hand that's always wet, so it doesn't stick to the length of clay and tear it off. As I pull, I change the orientation of the length so that my right hand can pull both the left and right sides equally. I pinch my index finger and thumb together, forming a loop, and the soft piece of skin between my index finger and thumb is the part of my hand that clay is running through. Once long enough, I cut individual segments off like so against the sharp edge of a wearboard, or even the side of a table works perfectly too. Each one of these is about 5 cm long, 1.5 cm wide, and approximately 8 mm thick. But once again, it doesn't matter if these aren't perfect. These are just the blanks, which I'll then attach to the pot and then pull again into their final shape. Reducing blanks like this is a quick and easy method, and with enough practice you can become exceedingly accurate too. There's no need to clean an extruder, and just by altering the shape of your hand a little bit, you can make blanks that are smaller, larger, all manner of shapes, without having to change the plate in the extruder each time. I work above a basin of water, that way most of the drips and the mess is contained, and all of this slip and clay that does come off on my hand I'll wash off in this basin, and eventually I'll add all of this back to my reclaim bucket, so very little is wasted. Once this length matches those I've already pulled, I'll add them to the board and continue snipping them off. I always pull a few more than I actually need, just in case I ruin a handle along the way, in the same way I always throw a few extra lids when I'm making lidded jars. Once I have enough, I stack them up. This helps to keep the handle blanks soft, but in the warmer months of the year, I'll even wrap them up with plastic and occasionally spray them with water, as I want these to be really quite soft when attaching them to the cup and pulling them. If they dry out too much, the process actually becomes even more difficult, as the clay doesn't respond to being pulled in quite the same way. You'll have to pinch and squeeze harder, which I find results in more errors, as lengths of clay get ripped away. When I'm working, I always want a clean patch on the table. This is the spot the mug will be placed down and the handle adjoined to it, so I keep it clean so no bits of clay embed themselves back into the bottom of the pot. I then scratch an area on the cup with a sharp serrated kidney. This patch is then daubed over with slip, and in between this and attaching the handle, I act quickly, as the longer I leave that slipped portion of the pot, the softer and therefore weaker that portion becomes. Next, I take a blank and I pat out one end like so. The rest of it is gripped in such a way that the actual length of clay isn't deformed by my hands and fingers that press around it. I flare out one end as it provides me with material that's easy to blend into the cup's body. I press the handle on firmly with the fingers of my left hand placed inside the pot, which brace the wall and stop the cup from deforming, and at this point the handle should be stuck on well enough that it can survive being tipped upside down and shaken around. I then blend all that flared out clay into the body of the cup, making a seamless and strong connection. I fettle all the way around it without taking any clay from the length of the handle itself, which, if you do that, it's very easy to create a weak point around this portion of the handle, which only makes it easier to tear off during the next stage. As the glazes I use go on quite thickly, they tend to hide quite a lot of these little maker's marks and grooves left around this area. If I were to use a much thinner glaze, or no glaze at all on the outside, I would spend a little more time making sure it blends in perfectly. I then douse the handle blank with water, and the final pulling and shaping can begin. With each pull, I'm placing my hand right up close to the mug and pinching between my thumb and forefinger, and then I pull that down the length, making sure that I don't release pressure until I'm well past the handle blank itself. Otherwise, a thicker portion will form on the end of the handle, which if your hand catches, there's a higher chance of it being ripped off. I then switch to using the tip of my thumb, which I press in and pull down along the back of the handle to create 3 distinct ridges. This thins it out and makes it very fine, but even at this point, I need to make sure that the clay is well hydrated, as if my fingers stick to the handle for even a second, they'll pull it too harshly, dragging it and creating a thin spot. The length is then looped down and joined near the bottom, and I don't need to score and slip here, as by pinching the clay off and really smearing this portion in, it creates a strong enough join. Next, I spend about 20 seconds blending this portion in, making sure it's nice and neat, and even using a wetted finger to brush over these areas to get rid of any of those smearing marks. I'll also just gently push up this portion of the handle so it has more of an ear shape, which makes for a very ergonomic and comfortable area for an index finger to hold the cup from. And whenever I'm touching the handle at this point, I'll make sure whatever digit I'm using has been dipped in water before doing so. That way it won't stick and potentially distort the handle as I detach that finger from it. They're then placed upside down so the handle doesn't slump downward as it dries. They're also placed on a plastic lined board, as these will be wrapped up overnight before checking the bottoms and carving the handles the following day. I dab the slip on rather than brush it, as I don't want to smooth over those scratched in lines. The blank is then pushed firmly from the back, and I make sure I don't squeeze the length too much, as if it's too distorted at this point, or if there's an obvious irregularity, that'll only be distorted as the length is pulled longer and thinner. And once again, as I pull, I make sure I'm squeezing from both sides. So I begin by pulling from the right, then switch to the left. This ensures that the cross-section of the handle is nice and even. And what I'm aiming for is sort of a very flat, oval shape. And I want both sides to be rounded, more or less, as that's what I find most comfortable to use. I then change my grip with my left hand, and then with my right hand, I hold the bottom portion of the handle and gently arc it downwards to the shape I want, snipping away any excess and making sure it sits straight on the form. I then blend the bottom in so it joins seamlessly like the top. And then if it needs it, I'll just push up gently right here and then curve that wet finger towards the body, just to make the handle spring up at a better angle. But like I said, I will be carving these once the handles are leather hard, And that isn't something I do with all of my cups and mugs, but occasionally I want that top join to be even finer and finished to a degree that just isn't possible to achieve when pulling handles like this. After they've all been pulled, I'll spray them lightly with water before wrapping them up with plastic overnight. This helps the two different components, which at this point are different levels of dryness, even out and become one consistent texture, which should help prevent any cracks from forming around the handle joins. If instead I just left these cups out, the handles, as they're much thinner than the cup, would dry out really quickly, and then as the two parts are drying out at different rates, the handle would crack and split, potentially even falling off the cup in extreme cases. The following day, I'll move the cups back over to the wheel, where I'll be doing two things. The first is carving the handles to remove just a bit of that excess clay around the top join, just to make them look that bit finer. The other thing I'll be doing is making sure the bases of the cups are pristine after the handling process, as if you look carefully you can see just a bit of run over on this portion, from where the handle was joined at the bottom. And it's from this top portion where I'll remove some clay to make this curve just a bit better and to remove a touch of the weight from it. For this process, I just use the tip of a paring knife. I never try to cut away too much at once, and instead I just remove clay bit by bit, moving both the cup and the knife to really achieve the looping curve I want. If I try to remove too much at once, I'd obviously have to use more pressure, and by doing that there's a good chance you can rip the entire handle off, which makes this relatively slow work, although I try to be quick, as my warm hands quickly dry out the leather hard clay, and if they become too bone dry, fixing the base and correcting the rim after this might be a bit tricky. I then carefully slice away stoneware from the top of the handle to make the angle at which the handle joins steeper. It's worth noting too that this entire handle is going to be covered in glaze, a glassy veneer of sorts, which will to some degree fill in some of the gaps, and even pool in certain areas, which will create more intense patches of glaze. Once the knife work's done, I then use a sponge on a stick that's very lightly soaked with water just to clean over some of the more carved areas. I also then use a fingertip to burnish those sponged areas smooth. It's a lot of work really for such a fine detail, but I think it really elevates the handle, making it far finer compared to what you'd normally expect from a hand-pulled handle. I'll then set the cup aside and move on to carving the next. Once they're all done, then I'll move on to double checking the base and forcing the rims over the solid chuck to make sure they're perfectly round, as the process of attaching a handle to a thrown pot and pulling it often does make it slightly oval in the direction the handle was attached. And that's one of the reasons I only attach the handles to my cups when they're really quite leather hard. I check when they're ready by gently squeezing the rim of the pot. If it easily distorts, then the cup is still way too soft for the handle to be attached. But if squeezed lightly and it holds its shape, then they're ready. I then place the cups over the chuck, tap center them, and then firmly push them down in place, forcing the slightly soft and still flexible rim to conform to the roundness of the chuck. I lightly trim the base and then burnish over it with a metal kidney, just to flatten and smooth it, as once again during the handling process, as it's picked up and put down on the workbench, the base can just be slightly damaged. That noise is a result of me pushing the cup down firmly against the chuck while spinning it, which again just forces it to be round. It can be tricky to center with the handle protruding out like this, and at this point I don't need to get them bang on in the middle, as really I'm just skimming the tools over these areas, rather than removing a lot of material. And this whole procedure really is just my attempt to make the base as pristine as it can be. I'd hate to flip a bisque-fired one upside down, only to find a lump of clay embedded into it, and so this procedure is something I do with most of my pots. It adds time to their creation of course, but not much, especially when you've got a good chuck to help you with the job. And here's a view of the carved handle, and you can see how it flows in at the top at a steeper angle, now that some of the excess has been incised away. And here's the glaze cup, more or less. They shrink in size about 12% from freshly thrown to finally fired, and you can see how the glaze has filled in certain spots on the handle itself. And here's a side-by-side comparison, which I think shows quite nicely just how much they change, from leather hard to coated in glaze and reduction fired in my gas kiln. Anyway, thanks as always for watching, and I really hope these videos are useful and interesting, especially to those learning how to throw and pull handles and make pots. Whenever I hear that it is, it always means so much. Thanks again, and I'll see you next week.